Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency's webinar, Gender Equality Targets from Compliance to Confidence. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today. Please feel free to share your own with us in the chat. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land. wgea acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognises the continuing connection to lands, waters and communities. We pay our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and to elders both past and present. I'll be your host and facilitator today. My name is Lexi Elliott and I'm the project lead in wgea's Targets Implementation team. We'll begin the session with presentations from wgea's CEO, Mary Wooldridge, and Evidence and Insights Manager, Elyse Lane, followed by time for questions. This webinar will run for about 60 minutes. Ultimately, you'll walk away from this session with information and resources to take your next steps to understand and implement gender equality targets for your organisation. Just some housekeeping before I introduce today's speakers. This session is being recorded, however, only the host and presenters will be visible on screen. But we want this session to be interactive and there will be time for a Q&A after we hear from our speakers. So to ask a question, please just type it in the Q&A window and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. So to introduce today's speakers, first we have Mary Wooldridge, who's the CEO of wgea. Mary comes with a wealth of experience from a distinguished career in the public, private and not-for-profit sectors. Mary served in the Victorian Parliament between 2006 and 2020. Her time in Parliament contributed to significant progress in the representation, strategy and policy relating to gender equality and violence against women and their children. We also have Elyse Lane, who's the Evidence and Insights Manager in wgea's Insights and Capability team. Elyse is a gender equality expert with over a decade of experience in government and international development, specialising in gender equality. Her key areas of expertise include gender pay gap analysis, action planning, and targets. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll now hand over to our first speaker, wgea CEO, Mary Wooldridge.
Thanks very much, Lexi, and it's wonderful to join everyone today. Appreciate everyone coming on board for this important webinar about selecting targets. And I really want to start, I suppose, with the big picture. And employers have been reporting to wgea for over 10 years now. And as a result, we've got this world-leading data set about gender equality in workplaces. And 2 weeks ago, our progress report, which we do biannually, was tabled in Parliament by the Minister. And I think it's really important to recognise and celebrate success. And we are making inroads into key areas that are unequal in workplaces, whether that be the composition issues in relation to senior roles, in relation to boards, whether it's the gender pay gap, or indicators of culture change in such as traditional male breadwinner norms in the uptake of men's parental leave. And so, it's worth celebrating that progress over time. Sometimes we don't see it year to year, but you need to have that longer term picture. And behind these outcome measures are also activity measures. One thing that's we're very positive about is the dramatic increase in the proportion of companies that have done a gender pay gap analysis, but also how many employers now have policies related to the 6 gender equality indicators that we collect data in relation to. And these are all positive directions. But in reality, the absolute results are still too high and change is still too slow. So in that context, wondered, there's been thinking about what reforms were needed. And here's the gender pay gap over time. And particularly you can see in that context 3 years ago how progress was stalling when a lot of this work was taking place. And it became clear that reporting data is not enough. We needed to do something more in the Australian context. So recent legislative changes to our Act have been a prompt for targeted action and to raise transparency and accountability about performance to accelerate change. So the first of these changes was the publishing of employer gender pay gaps. That was based on the UK model, and we've now been doing that for 2 years. The second is this new requirement passed by the Parliament in March, related to selecting and meeting gender equality targets. And models from elsewhere showed that many who were leading the way in this area were setting a requirement for employers to do action plans. But while a plan is obviously necessary, it's not enough to guarantee positive change. So a lot of thought went into what the Australian policy context would be. And with the evidence that targets work and the desire to see outcomes, this is why this gender equality target setting scheme was put into place. Now, before I go into detail, I just want to take a moment to reflect on the point in time for you and your workplace. So people on this webinar are the ones who will be responsible for the process of selecting targets and implementing them and bringing them to life, making them result in positive outcomes in your workplace. And I really want to encourage you that this is an opportunity. So when we published gender pay gaps for the first time, we repeatedly heard from people and culture leads and from HR teams that it helped open a door to conversations with the CEO, with C-suite, with boards about gender equality and about fairness and safety at work. And that in publishing gender pay gaps, senior executives and directors realised that they really needed to enhance their literacy in relation to gender equality. And in those things that were happening, it opened a door and created an opportunity for people to make sure that they could have conversations that they hadn't been able to previously, or to progress issues that they'd been trying to get onto the agenda but had not been able to do so previously. So, really positive opportunity. So we really see the next 8 months leading up to selecting gender equality targets as an opportunity to be grasped, to really drive understanding and through that, drive change. Engagement with the data, engagement with employees, supporting the development of a plan and critically getting buy-in from the CEO and the governing body, because ultimately these targets will be published and they are the ones that will be held publicly accountable for it. So evidence shows that targets drive change, both through this period in relation to the thinking about, the analysis, the planning, and the selection of targets, and also then in subsequently the transparency and accountability through the implementation and the achievement of those targets and the ongoing monitoring of progress. So it is an opportunity. It's an incredible time, we think, and we want to support you to make sure that you can take the opportunity in your own workplace. So in terms of how the design came about, and a lot of thought went into this, and these are the key principles. Firstly, employers have flexibility to choose targets that work for their business and reflect their own gender equality journey. So it's all about the choice that you have from a range of options. We wanted to make sure that we could keep it simple. So the measure is, while we're seeking for employers to meet their targets, all progress is good. Analysis on outcomes in designing the scheme showed that on any of the key outcome measures, between a quarter to half of all employers went backwards in any given year. And so we were able to come to the conclusion that rather than set complicated targets, thresholds to be achieved, that progress, anything moving forward was what we were seeking in terms of the outcome. Most employers are already using targets and as a normal part of business. And in fact, many are also using gender equality targets and have them in place. So the opportunity is for them to build on them, or if you don't have them, to set them for the first time. And finally, we wanted to use what employers were already reporting to wgea for monitoring, so that any time spent on this could be spent on selecting and meeting targets, not on additional reporting requirements. So the only thing you need to report additionally as a result of this is the targets you select and the percentage point change for numeric targets, or the additional entitlements or processes for action targets. And this is why it's important that employers can't design their own targets, and they have to be selected from the menu that's defined. But these are the principles that underpin the way the scheme works. So in terms of being very clear about who it applies to, this applies to designated relevant employers, is the name in the legislation. This means employers who directly employ 500 or more employees. That's pretty straightforward for a standalone company, but for corporate groups or submission groups where there's multiple entities involved, it is counted by ABN. So each ABN within a submission group that employs 500 or more employees will have to select targets, and the rest don't have to select them. 3 different targets have to be selected, and there's that commitment to achieve them as well in the selection process. And the CEO signs off on the gender equality report that's provided to wgea. So in effect, they're also at the same time signing off on the targets and committing to achieving those targets as part of that process. So at least one of the targets must be numeric, and this is the outcome result that we were seeking to see. You can pick multiple numeric ones if you like, but at least one must be numeric. And an action target can't be selected that commits to doing something that's already in place. So if you've told us you already have paid parental leave, you can't choose an action target that would be to put in a paid parental leave scheme, because that's already in place. In terms of the achievement of targets, at the end of the 3-year cycle, we will assess whether that target has been met or whether improvement has been demonstrated against the baseline year. And if the employers don't meet or demonstrate improvement against each of their targets at the end of that 3-year cycle, they won't be compliant with the Act. So, and just for anyone from the Commonwealth Public Sector on the call, the baseline year is 2024. For everyone else, for the private sector, it's the reporting that you've just done to us, the 2024-2025 year. So as you can see through the chart at the bottom, baseline year's just been passed. Next year when you report, you'll select your targets. There'll be 2 years of monitoring of progress. And it's actually in 2029, when you report for the 2028-29 year, that the comparison will be made back to the baseline year. We're going to publish the targets that have been selected on the Data Explorer, and that's an important part of the transparency and accountability that happens. And we will report both that and the progress annually back to employers through the executive summary, which is required to be provided by the CEO to your board. So basically that's the cycle for targets. So in terms of the menu itself, if we have a look at the next slide, there are 19 different choices in relation to what you can pick for your targets. And as I said, one needs to be numeric. And look, each of these have been selected to be included in the menu because it's backed by evidence that this is what works to improve gender equality in workplaces. And as we've said, this is already part of what you report to wgea. Many of the action targets actually can help you achieve your numeric targets. So it's good to think about the targets and how they work together. For each numeric target, it specifies an increased representation in an underrepresented gender. That's the language of the Act. So because we advocate for gender balance in roles and occupations, where it's not. And it could be that it's a highly masculinized role or occupation that you're looking to get more women in, or it could be a highly feminized role or occupation where you're looking to get more men in, for example. So it's about heading towards that balance, and it's an underrepresented gender. This is not just about women, it's about women and men across the workplace. Now, I do encourage you to have a look at our Targets Hub on the website, which has more detail, including how you can find your baseline results in your public report or your executive summary, when you're eligible to select different targets, and those sorts of things. So, and Elyse will touch on that at the end. Now, two last things I just want to touch on before I hand over to Elyse is firstly about what does meeting or demonstrating improvement actually mean? And let me give you two examples. The first one's a numeric one. You might pick increased representation of an underrepresented gender for managers, and you have to choose one of those manager categories. Let's say you've chosen a 10 percentage point improvement. The target's met if you've got 10% or more, but demonstrated improvement is any shift in a positive way towards that target. So it could be anything over zero is a demonstration of improvement in relation to that outcome. In terms of action targets, and a simple example there of one about equal remuneration policies, you've got to add 2 to your policies. Now, if you add those 2 and you tell us when you report at the end that you now have those policies in place, the target's met. If you were to have implemented one of them, that would be demonstrated improvement. But just thinking or doing policy development work and not having yet put at least one in place would not. So that just gives you an idea. And finally, I just wanted to touch on compliance. There are 2 ways that you can be non-compliant with the Act. The first is if you don't select and commit to achieve targets next year. And the second one is if you haven't, in the final year, met or demonstrated improvement against each of those targets. So they're the 2 ways you can be non-compliant. If you're non-compliant with the Act, then the same process applies as is currently in place with the Act. There is no change in relation to that. So firstly, the agency only names those employers who don't have a reasonable excuse. And the definition of what's considered to be a reasonable excuse is intended to be a flexible concept to try and avoid unjust outcomes that might happen where circumstances have genuinely prevented someone from meeting their legal obligations. So, and because not all non-compliance is the same, and we don't treat everyone the same, when we identify non-compliance, we're really trying to understand what the reasons are behind it. So there are, some circumstances in which would not be a reasonable excuse is if the employer it was a busy time, if there were changes to the CEO or key personnel so that they didn't understand their obligations, if reporting contacts email changed and so you didn't get the emails, or someone was unaware that it needed to happen. So that sort of passive not knowing, not following, not understanding is not a reason for non-compliance. And look, we've been careful not to say to define what would be a reasonable excuse. But we've tried to say, it'll be, individual circumstances will be taken into account to make sure it's fair for all employers who take time to report, while understanding that sometimes exceptional circumstances occur that means it's reasonable for that not to have been achieved. And of course, the other aspect of non-compliance is in the procurement principles that you cannot contract with federal government if you're not compliant with the Act. So our compliance strategy on a website goes into that in more detail, and there'll be a link to that later as well. So that gives you the context of how the scheme works. I'll now hand over to Elyse in terms of how you think about going about selecting your targets.
Thank you, Mary, and really good to see so many of you today. So we've just heard Mary set the scene for target setting, including an overview of the legislation. But target setting is just one component of a broader framework for effectively addressing workplace gender equality. And on your screen, you'll see a navigation system which wgea endorses and which we like to call the triangle of success. So the foundation of the framework begins with doing a gender pay gap analysis to take a data-driven approach. This helps employers to understand their hotspots, which are gendered trends in the data, which may indicate gendered issues that need to be addressed. Now, a comprehensive gender pay gap analysis is going to go beyond those top line metrics. So it's going to go beyond your gender pay gaps and your gender composition gaps and dig deeper into the data to look at things like differences in mobility, talent pools, and even patterns of engagement. The second part of that framework is to engage in an interdependent action planning process. This should be driven by the results of the gender pay gap analysis and will involve determining gender equality outcomes to strive for and then designing that plan of action to achieve those outcomes. Now, prioritization of those actions is a key focus of action planning because, frankly, there are just so many actions that you could take. So figuring out which actions to take for the most effective progress is a process that often requires balancing factors such as, resourcing or your broader business priorities. Some actions also might address multiple hotspots, and that's something that's also worth consideration as you work through your options and figure out your plan. And then, of course, the third component of that framework and our topic of conversation today is targets. This is the crucial last component that articulates intention and provides the means for tracking progress against your action plan. By tracking progress against targets, employers can get a better sense of which actions are succeeding and which may need a little bit of recalibration. And as Mary said, targets shift the focus to outcomes, and they do this by creating a constant feedback loop, which keeps employers motivated. And I'll talk a little bit more about that feedback loop in a moment. I want to reassure you that wgea has resources and supports for each of the components in that framework, and you can see there are some QR codes on your screen. If you miss them because we're about to change slides, don't worry, I'm going to talk about resources a little bit later. Okay, so we know that targets are a key component of taking action, and we've spoken about how they create that feedback loop that drives progress. But why? Why do they work? So in simplest terms, targets are just aspirational goals that can be used as a mechanism to benchmark progress. They can be tied to either quantitative or qualitative metrics as long as they're smart. And by that, I mean specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Effective targets are an unambiguous commitment to prioritizing specific areas for progress. They amplify all the strengths of goal setting and, by extension, drive that change in behavior that we need to see. And this is because, as Harvard scholars Iris Bonet and Siri Chalazi have asserted, they address both the will and the way to drive that behavior change. They create accountability and they shape effort. When progress is measured and has clear consequences, either positive or negative, action is more likely to take place and with the requisite level of intention and planning. Targets also require clear lines of accountability, and that's usually going to start right at the top with the key decision makers, but it also may extend down throughout the organisation. They help bridge the gap between intention and outcomes, and they serve as a practical way to address needs expressed in the data analysis. Now, there is a lot of good work being done out there on gender equality. I see it, I hear about it all the time, but all too often the missing link is a consciously designed action plan with those smart, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound targets in place, because they're crucial for us to be able to measure and also evaluate our progress on gender equality. And research indicates that organisations that set gender targets see faster and more sustainable progress towards their diversity goals. And an important component of this is what's known as self-efficacy. When organisations become more experienced and capable at identifying the problems and then taking action to address them, they create that positive feedback loop I was talking about. So by measuring progress, we reinforce the value of the actions that we take, and that in turn reinforces our commitment and drives the momentum that we need to see. Now, the science here is finding the sweet spot between feasibility and stretch targets. Employers will want to end up having impact, but it needs to be within scope as well, so that they're gaining the benefits of that self-efficacy and really driving momentum. The alternative is if we set those goalposts too high, which can lead to momentum, slowing down or even stopping. So the best way to find the balance for any organisation is to return to the data and look at the trends over time, whenever that's possible, to understand your data. That's the best guide for setting realistic stretch targets. Okay, now in terms of target selection, there are 6 key steps that WGEA recommends, and following these steps will help you to confidently select effective targets in 2026. Now, this is just a brief version of what you're going to find in our target selection guide that can be downloaded from the Targets Hub on our website. The first critical step is to conduct or review your comprehensive gender pay gap analysis, which I've already mentioned. This is going to help you to identify the drivers of gender imbalance in your workplace. And from there, you'll want to move into creating that action plan and then selecting the targets that will best monitor and track the progress of those actions in that plan. Now, part of this process, as Mary's already mentioned, is determining what any numeric targets are going to be. And as stated previously, this will involve returning to that data analysis and back to that baseline to find the balance between what is realistic and what will stretch organisations to drive the progress. You can also look on the WGEA Data Explorer at industry trends over time, or you can look at your peers' performance in order to benchmark your potential progress. Now, it can also be really helpful to break those numeric targets up into smaller sub-targets. So, for example, if an employer is thinking of setting a gender pay gap reduction target of 5 percentage points in 3 years, it might be helpful to think of it in terms of what's going to be achieved year on year. So, for example, they might set a reduction goal of 1 percentage point in that first year when they're still implementing and bedding down those actions, and then they might aim for something a bit more ambitious, so maybe 2 percentage point decreases in the subsequent 2 years. It's just a different way of thinking about it, but exactly the same end goal. And then for the final step, by the time we're getting there, employers should have already engaged their employees on the topic of target setting. But once the work's been done to select targets and determine the numbers, it's a really good time to check back in. Employees are a great source to workshop ideas, and in being transparent about the target setting process, employers are much more likely to be able to anticipate and handle any resistance that might come. If employees feel like they've been consulted and that the process is not some mystery happening behind closed doors, they are more likely to buy in and engage and understand that gender equality targets have been designed to progress gender equal workplaces, which benefit everyone. And finally, the C-suite and the board engagements also help to create that authorising environment for achieving all of those targets. So make sure that they're playing a lead role as well. All right, so I wanted to share a case study with you today. Mary and I have talked a lot about the legislation and the processes, but I wanted to share a case study from CPB Contractors, who are a leading major contractor working on complex infrastructure projects across Australia and New Zealand. And consistent with broader trends in the construction industry, they are quite heavily male-dominated. So I wanted to start off by showing you a short video, if we could get that up and running.
It was good 1 to 2 years of working, walked through the tunnel, checked every single bit, and on the day of opening, it gives a sense of pride that I have contributed to the success of this project.
I think for our industry, it's all about shifting the perceptions of the roles that women can do.
There was a project of national significance, came few kilometers away from my house, and I was very excited, and I just joined. There was one more electrical engineer who was in my team. I was inspired by her. It just boosted me, like if she has done it or she has been doing it, I can also do it, not a problem.
we're absolutely committed to this, and that we have seen that having more women and having a gender diverse workforce produces better results and produces better project delivery outcomes, better cultures, places where our people want to work. We've had targets in place for a long time, but what we've seen is that it allows us to create the awareness with our leadership group, have something to work towards, and actually provide them with an update on how we're tracking. And I think, yeah, ultimately for me, it's just what gets measured gets done. My top tip is that other companies need to really get under the hood of their data and where they currently sit, because you'll learn a lot from that. That allows you to hone in quite easily on the areas you should be focusing on and come up with really clear, measurable goals and targets that you can then create accountability to deliver on those targets with your leaders in your business, because at the end of the day, they need to be on board with it because they're the ones that will make it happen.
Beautiful, great. So as you saw in the video, CPB have been using targets for some time. They've identified target setting as a way to create awareness among their leadership about gender equality and to measure their progress. We saw a commitment to gender equality as a driver of better outcomes for projects, for culture, and for the people who work for CPB. And we saw them take the same data-driven approach that I've been advocating about today. They urged other employers to get under the hood to understand any gendered trends and then to set targets to address them. So I wanted to bring this case study to you as an example of an employer who's already doing the work. They're setting targets and they're seeing progress. CPB have industry-related challenges, and I think they'd be the first ones to tell you that they still have some work to do, but they're using the components in that triangle of success to address them. And I think we can see from that video that targets was a really important component of that work. Okay, so where to from here? Now, we always try to make sure we're enabling employers to build the tools and capability to take meaningful action on gender equality. And that means taking the information that we've given to you today back to your workplace and enabling that action across the entire coalition of influence. In this case, initial conversations will probably be more focused within HR, the executive of the board, but down the track, it will probably include line managers as well, because they're really crucial for embedding action into processes and business practice. So my advice to you today is to have a look at this triangle and locate yourself. If you haven't done a gender pay gap analysis, get started with one of our masterclasses and have a look at our resources. If you're ready for action planning, go to WGEA's website and use our action planning tool to discover a tailored list or advice about the actions that you could take that would work for your context, and use that alongside our action planning playbook to develop a plan for implementation. And if you already have your plan, you have your metrics, you're ready to go for April, start thinking about what targets you're going to choose and the plans you need to have in place or need to put in place to achieve them. Now, as we said earlier in the session, many employers are probably already using targets, but we know that for many of you, this will be a first time as well. So we want you to do this with confidence. And to help you, we've developed a comprehensive suite of resources. A good starting point is the Targets Hub on the WGEA website, which includes an FAQ to common questions about the new requirements and also links to WGEA's Target Selection Guide. Now, this page is going to continue to be updated as new resources become available. And I've mentioned a lot of the resources already. If you have completed a gender pay gap analysis and an action plan, then one masterclass I didn't mention is the Targets Masterclass with WGEA's gender equality experts. So if you're at that point, please sign up. If you haven't completed a gender pay gap analysis or an action plan, as stated previously, there are masterclasses that we run frequently there for you too. For employers that have taken all of those steps, but maybe do need some additional support, we do have an advisory service where they can come and receive tailored advice and support. But lastly, I'd like to recommend really bookmarking our Targets Hub webpage, as well as signing up to our newsletter or LinkedIn to make sure you get the updates on these changes and notice of any new resources as they become available. And that's it from me. If I can leave you with any message today, I'd like it to be that target selection is part of that broader action planning process, and that there's lots of support out there to help you with that process if you need it. So now I'll pass back to Lexi to begin the Q&A section.
Great. Thank you, Elyse, for those insights about the actions that employers can take ahead of target selection in 2026. We'll include links to those resources that Elyse mentioned when we send out the slide deck after this session. Thank you also to our CEO, Mary, for the deep dive on what's changing in the legislation and how to comply with it. We'll now go to about 20 minutes of Q&A from the floor. And we might start with a question for Mary, which is, we have made significant progress in closing the gender pay gap and parental leave policies. How do we choose targets when there may not be many action targets that are relevant to us?
It's a good question, and it's fantastic if you're in that context. But I think the advice is there's always things that you can do. You can choose to have multiple numeric targets, and I've seen there's a couple of people saying they've done most of the action targets. So choose numeric ones. There's always things that can improve. And if your macro numbers in terms of your balance of managers, for example, are roughly gender balanced, then have a look beneath that and see from your gender pay gap analysis where things perhaps aren't as balanced as they could be otherwise, and work on components of it. Now, you have to select the targets that are listed in the menu. You can't choose them at your own level. It has to be those wgea manager categories and the ANZIC non-manager categories. But that doesn't stop you working on a specific group within one of those categories that if you shift that balance, that will flow up through your aggregate numbers and get an improved result. Elyse, is there anything else you'd add to that?
No, I think I agree, Mary. I've had some advisory sessions with employers in exactly the same boat. We've always found that there are things that can be done. So, for example, if you're looking at those top line metrics and maybe your composition at leadership looks good, one example would be an organisation that found that they were really having trouble attracting women to their factory and retaining women. So there was a lot of work that could be done there. So I would echo what you're saying. Look deeper at the data, do that comprehensive gender pay gap analysis, and there's always work to be done.
Wonderful, thank you. Elyse, this one's for you. It was, one of the targets is to conduct a gender pay gap analysis. Is this over and above what is being recommended to start with before you select targets?
So it is part of what we recommend for the target selection process. What I would say in terms of over and above, the comprehensive gender pay gap analysis process is a really well-defined process, and there's a lot of guidance on our website and a masterclass to attend if you haven't done one before. It does look beyond the data that you are reporting to WGEA. Now, the WGEA compliance data is a really great place to start, and the pay gap analysis process mostly covers data that you're already reporting to us. But as I stated, we need to go beyond that and look a little bit deeper at things like patterns of engagement. So, for example, what I was speaking to before, are we attracting women into our organisation? Are we shortlisting, at the same rates? Is it proportionate? So it is a much deeper dive than just completing your WGEA reporting. I think that's what the question was aiming at.
Let me add to that, because I think there's also a specific one. If you in 2024-5 or 3-4 have not ticked that you have done a comprehensive gender pay gap analysis, it's open for you to select that as a target. So if you haven't done it in the last 2 years, but you're doing it as part of this process, it can be one of the targets that can be selected. Now, we'd encourage you to select others if you've already done it, but remember, for all of this, it's compared against what you reported to us this year for 2024-25. So there may be some things, there may be some policies. I know there's some other questions. There may be some other policies that are being put in place now and are progressing over time. That can be part of your target setting agenda if you wanted to, or you can continue to push yourself in terms of what else you're going to put in place over the next 3 years.
Brilliant. Thank you. The next question we have is for Mary. So someone said, I manage 3 ABNs, 2 with more than 500 employees and 1 with fewer than 100. Do I need to select different targets for them all, or do the targets need to be different?
So no, and this is for people who submit as a corporate group or submission group, you can choose to select the same targets for the different entities within your submission group. But just make sure that makes sense. If you want to continue to report as a submission group, you will need to select those same action targets, because the only way you can submit the WGEA reporting as a submission group if your policies are the same or very similar. So it doesn't preclude you from having the same ones across the organisation. For example, if you don't have parental leave, you could be putting parental leave into each of your agencies. For the numeric ones, though, I would suggest that you need to set specific targets for each of the entities, reflecting their own composition and the challenges within them. So you will be asked for each of the individual designated relevant employers what your targets are, and then it's up to you about how you respond to that. And as I say, they can be the same action targets that can be selected across those entities, so that you can continue to submit as a group.
Brilliant. The next one we have is for Elyse. So Elyse, how would targets apply to heavily regulated industries? As an example, mandatory legal requirements to be met in order to progress senior leadership roles.
Yeah, so the system has been, it's a universal system. It's been designed for everyone, for every industry, whether they're heavily regulated or not. That's why we've got a very comprehensive menu of targets that we think will apply no matter what the industry is. Obviously, there are going to be different challenges in different industries. There are going to be some industries where there are those obligations and they intersect with the targets menu. We understand that, and we've had these conversations. We went through a really robust consultation process as part of the design of the menu, but essentially it still applies even if you have other requirements under state legislation. This is a different circumstance, so you still have to set your 3 targets even if you have those other obligations.
Excellent, thank you. Mary, this next one's for you. I work for a global organisation that has employees and leads spread across the world. Given this and the current political climate in other countries, such as the US, there's some sensitivity around how we approach this topic. This makes it quite difficult to set a numeric target. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, look, this is obviously important context. It only relates to your Australian employees, which is what WGEA covers. And secondly, and I've talked to a lot of global companies through the process, is the feedback we get very clearly is it's a legal requirement in the country that they operate, and therefore they're comfortable fulfilling those legal requirements. And they will continue to do so. So I think there's some cover on the fact that this is a law and it's a requirement. And if you want to procure with government, then you're required to be compliant with the Act. So, we are seeing perhaps people aren't shouting things from the rooftops as much as they might have been in the past in relation to DEI issues broadly. But I think, the engagement with employees, the, internal communications, can continue to reinforce that in the Australian context, this is really important. It's required by the law, and it's something that we're going to do, and we're going to just have sensible discussions and make a good plan for how we can make sure that people are having a gender equal experience at work.
Brilliant, thank you. Elyse, we've been asked, my organisation already has a high participation of women. What should my numeric targets look like?
Yeah, I think this speaks to the question that Mary answered before, and that's wonderful. I mean, that is a great achievement. But I think there is opportunity usually to have a deeper look at the data, look beyond composition. I see a lot of employers that might have wonderful gender balance in their leadership, and that's very commendable, but they might still have a gender pay gap, or there might be work that can be done on parental leave, for example. So the menu is much broader than just composition and pay gaps. Definitely have a look at all of the other options, and I think that you'll be able to find 3 targets to set.
Definitely. Mary, we've been asked, will 2026 reporting and targets be based on ANZIC groups, or will we need to update to OSCA?
So there is a recommendation to actually collect data at a much more detailed ANZIC level than the level 1, so that we could do more analysis in relation to work groups and employee types. At the moment, we're sticking with ANZIC just because that's what has been done in the past, but we do have to look, of course, at the OSCA codes and how that transition can be made. We would do some consultation with employers before we would make that shift, because obviously that would have ramifications for everyone.
Brilliant. And we've also got another one for you. Do the targets and progress/achievement of these get published publicly each year, or only at the end of the 3-year period?
So we will publish targets on the Data Explorer, and that's your what you've selected, and both in terms of the target itself and the numeric or actions you're committing to as part of that target. And we publish on the Data Explorer and through data.gov.au all the employer information generally as well. So that is publicly available. You will be provided with progress though back through your executive summary, because you've got 3 years in which to meet or demonstrate improvement against the targets. We won't be doing a specific publishing of matching the target against progress, but we will be reporting that back through the executive summary, so that people who receive that, and including your board, can monitor progress against it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. We also have other non-manager category options for the gender composition target fixed, or can you choose a different category of non-manager that makes sense for your business?
I think this is where it ties back into the principle of not requiring additional reporting to wgea in order to be able to monitor targets. So in each case, and I think there's some other questions along these lines as well, it's connected to what you report to us currently, and you report your non-manager categories against those level 1 ANZIC codes. So that's what the target needs to be set against. There are lots of other targets we would have liked to have had, but we don't collect the data, and frankly, you don't want us to require more information to be provided. So, the principle behind this is it monitors it against the information you already provide. Therefore, for both the manager and non-manager categories and across the board, it's connected to what is already reported.
Thank you. Elyse, this one's for you. We've been asked, are there 3 examples for good targets to set? Achieving gender parity, 40-60% at top leadership, introduce carers at work committee to support employees with caring responsibilities, reduce the median total remuneration. What are the sort of best 3 someone could set? Is there one?
Oh, I wish I had that recipe for everyone. If I did, I would give it to you. This is very context-based, and this is why we're really encouraging you to know your data, do that gender pay gap analysis process. It's going to look different for everyone. I think I touched on that there are lots of different factors to consider when you're setting your targets. If you're looking at your composition, that's going to impact your gender pay gap as well. And so do a lot of the action targets. Mary mentioned that many of the action targets support those numeric targets as well. So no, There's no best targets to set. It is definitely very, very relative to your specific context. Sorry.
Thank you, Elyse. Mary, we've got another one. If you submit various ABNs and achieve your targets in 9 out of the 10 and not the numeric, would that be non-compliance of the group as a whole?
No. So in this context, the targets relate specific to the ABN, the entity itself, and there's not a obligation or a reflection on the whole corporate group if one part of the organisation is unable to achieve the target. So no, it sits with the entity itself.
Brilliant. We also have a slightly longer one for you, Mary. Someone's asked, in establishing the approach for targets, there's been consultation and consideration with state-based requirements. In Victoria, under the Gender Equality Act, we have significant obligations around gender equality action planning and progress reporting. It would be good to understand if any mapping has been done by WGEA in identifying common obligations.
Yeah, and I suspect this person is a university in Victoria, which are part of a very small group that have both responsibility to report to the Victorian Commission and to wgea. Although often companies contracting with government do have additional obligations as well. We have done that mapping, and in fact we're working very hard to try and streamline so that state public sectors also reported to wgea. Unfortunately, due to the joys of our federation, we haven't been able to progress that one. But in terms of the target setting requirements, there's not a requirement in Victoria under the Commission for target setting. The other thing to think about is the recent requirements at a federal level to set targets for big construction projects, for example. That's one of the reasons we've put apprentices in as a potential area for target to try and align with that requirement that if you're already setting targets for representation in your apprentices for big projects, you could also do that for wgea reporting. So we do try and take that into account.
Thank you, Mary. Elyse, we've been asked, can you also specify the role/engagement of the board? Do we submit these targets for the noting of the boards, or does the board need to approve these targets?
Yeah, so the targets are going to go into the executive summary, which is required to be reported up to the board. How individual organisations handle that, my advice would be, and as I said in the piece about consultation, getting your key decision makers involved early in the piece, including the board, is highly advisable. But either which way, the targets are going to be in that executive summary, which goes right up to the board anyway. So that would be my advice. Definitely include them early. It's going to go up there anyway. So,
and just for the process specifically, it's your CEO who signs off on the wgea gender equality report. As Elyse said, get your board on board and your executive and C-suite. But in terms of formal processes, it's the CEO who signs off on the submission of those targets.
Brilliant. Oh, yeah, there. I've unmuted myself. It seems that we have about 5 minutes left, so we have time for one final question before Mary will make some comments to close up the session. This one could actually be for you both. What are some final tips for HR teams to lay a strong foundation and to get support for action on gender equality with company leaders?
You start, Elyse.
Okay. Yeah, look, I think that is a really, really crucial piece of the puzzle. And I think we saw CPP talking to that as well, about targets really being an opportunity to get that leadership buy-in for gender equality more broadly. And I think part of that is, I've never met a leader who doesn't love data. So again, going in prepared, knowing what's in your data, what's in your baseline, and being able to really have that conversation and that understanding of, what is happening, what is the state of the organization, and some areas that, you might want to address. And I think really that is the key kind of, I think it's actually an opportunity right now, and it's really important that we frame this conversation not as a box ticking exercise, that this is something that we have to do, but this is a real opportunity for us to drive progress on gender equality. And I think if the conversation is framed in that way, I think you're going to lay a good foundation for getting that leadership buy-in that you need. But Mary, do you have anything to add?
I think what you've said's absolutely right. And we're back to an opportunity. There's an open door. There's a potential to engage, and there's an opportunity to really drive change, achieve things you've been thinking about, need to happen, that your employees are telling you need to happen. And this is a context that allows you to realise that, to change the dynamic in the workplace.
Thank you both. That's all the questions that we have time for. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question today. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of them, but we will be reviewing the ones that we didn't get to and making sure that any themes that emerge are included in our Targets FAQ in the Targets Hub on our website. So please make sure you keep an eye out for that. We have just a few minutes left, and we'd love to hear from you about what you thought of this webinar. So a poll will appear on your screens asking how satisfied you are with the content that you've heard and seen today. While you're filling it out, I'll hand over to Mary for some final closing comments.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lexi. And, really just to reiterate, thank you for the work that you do. Thanks for being here and being engaged in this process. What you're about to do is an incredible opportunity to drive change. This next period in getting ready in terms of the selection of targets is absolutely crucial. Target setting is a skill and capability that you'll use, you're probably already using it, or if you're learning it, you'll use in lots of ways in years to come. There's an opportunity in the next 9 months to really use the context of the legislation to embed gender equality targets as part of the culture, as part of what you do, as part of your business as usual, and to make sure then that can be utilised in an ongoing way in the future, to make sure you're creating environments and a gender equal experience for all your employees. So thanks for being here today. As we've said, we will share this recording, we will share the slides. That will be, as quickly as we can turn them around. We'll be updating the FAQs, and please keep connected with the information. We'll continue to let you know as more resources, support and information becomes available. Thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon.